On September 16, 2022, 22-year-old Mahsa Jina Amini died while in custody of the government's morality police for wearing improper hijab. This sent shockwaves throughout Iran. A massive protest movement commenced in response as Iranians demanded justice for Amini and equal rights for women. My name is Sydney Martin, and I'm the program manager and a researcher here at the Iran 1400 Project. I recently conducted interviews with a variety of scholars about the woman life freedom movement. Here's what they had to say.
Before we talk about the achievement, problems, future prospects of women life freedom movement, perhaps we can talk about briefly about the significance of this movement. The women life freedom movement, Zan Zindagi Azadi, as many already said, I think it's a turning point in post-revolutionary Iran. Not because all of a sudden things changed on September 16, 2022, after the death in detention of Jina Mahsa Amini, but because it simply made it crystal clear that Iran's civil society has experienced gradual but paradigmatic shifts, transformation, both discursively, intellectually, and structurally, in terms of demography, class formation, and things like that. So that's a societal part. But equally important, I think, we need to mention that the women life freedom movement revealed to many people the real nature of the state. Basically, the state has regressive, reactionary transformation over the past few decades, from a hybrid state to a more and more authoritarian and even some elements of semi-totalitarian trends. So if that's the case, I'll briefly talk about each dimension, society and state. From the societal factors, civil society, I think, as I mentioned here and there, and some other colleagues mentioned this, post-revolutionary Iran has already, has already entered into a post-Islamist condition, not post-Islam as a religion and culture, but post-Islamism, where to a majority of people, actually, the Islamist emperor is naked these days, has no clothes. Islamism, both as an ideology and institution in the form of a state, I think has lost its mobilization power, and it's socially and discursively fragile, failed, frustrated, but obviously politically and institutionally is still not collapsed, definitely, and I'll talk about this. So the fact that women are the pioneers of this movement, the youth generation, Z and others, are in the forefront of this movement. They clearly demands of their rights, reclaim their dignity, Zan Zindagi Azadi. All of this actually shows that these ideas and discourse and values are deeply rooted in society. The society is ready in terms of its quest. And I don't want to mention the long history of social movement from constitutional revolution until now, even post-revolution in Iran. Like a few months after the revolution, protests, women's protests in March 1979, late 1980s, 1997 onwards, 2009, 2017 onwards. So there is a rich history of social movement. So that's the societal factor. The state has shown its real face, in the sense that now, to the majority of people, actually, the state is nothing but, I guess, basically a clerical oligarchy backed by military security apparatus and supported and funded by rentier structure of the political economy, oil-centered, oil rentier state, which has systematically over the past decade or two marginalized the majority. And that's very important. So we have a big class of marginalized majority, subaltern in Iran, in terms of gender, generation, culture, religion. So in a way, the state has systematically turned the citizen into subaltern. It has systematically produced systemic disempowerment or istizaf. So culturally, as I said, socially, politically, economically, in all aspects of it. So in a way, it rules in the name of the poor, or at least it used to say this, at least in the first decade or so. But now we know that it's in the service of oligarch. It's like a predatory state. Similarly, it rules in the name of God, but is in the service of crony, clerical kleptocracy. So I think it's fair in that sense to say that a state has betrayed both the sacred and the secular in different ways. And I think thanks to this movement, I think this complexity has been clear and revealed to the majority of people. Now, with this brief introduction, I can say a few words about the nature of this movement. What is this movement and why it's a turning point and significant? I'm not trying to romanticize things, of course, and I'll get to the weaknesses, of course, but I want to suggest that how significant is this movement. So Women Life Freedom Movement, I think it's a progressive, women-friendly movement of the subaltern, the majority of the people, a marginalized majority, I would say, whose dignity is been crushed, and they've been subject to internal colonialism, as my colleague Asif Bayat actually extensively written about this. Again, I repeat myself, culturally, socially, in terms of gender, class, politics, all of these things. And I think it's fair to say that, interestingly, Mahsa Jina Amini is in fact became a personification of matrix of suppression under an Islamist oligarchy. And I say why? Because she represented, first and foremost, as a woman. And we know that women has been systematically marginalized. Youth as a big class, and of course, culturally, socially, actually quite different from the ruling authority. A middle class poor, a class which is growing not only in Iran, but in the whole Middle East, and perhaps everywhere, even in the global north. A class where, I guess, culturally, intellectually, they belong to the middle class, but economically, they are poor. And this actually created tension. And Mahsa Amini actually represents one of those growing class. A Kurdish minority, a Sunni Muslim, again, another religious minority, and from a periphery, a small town. So you see, the combination of all of these things actually support my argument that there is a marginalized majority subaltern who has lost its dignity and rights. And Mahsa's death actually was a trigger to show this anger, frustration, and quest for reclaiming dignity. So in this sense, I think it's fair to say that a Women Life Freedom movement has been an ethical movement to reclaim dignity and recognition of rights, a social movement for freedom, perhaps new social movement, because cultural and non-economic and financial concerns are very much dominated, typical of new social movement. And also perhaps a version of Iranian Renaissance, if you wish. in quest for gender justice, dignified life, and freedom. So, and lastly, but certainly not the least, I would say it represents a global movement, a combination of local, I guess, demands, tradition, norms in conversation with global trends and values. Global. And this is very interesting because it actually challenges some of the conventional arguments about not only Iran, but the whole Muslim world and Middle East in general. The Orientalist arguments that this region is not ready for democracy, they cannot have gender equality, or Orientalism in reverse, in form of nativist argument of Islamism or hyper-nationalist folds, or even to some extent, some particular interpretation or reading of cultural relativists, who suggest that this region, these countries are so particular and exceptional to values and institutions of democracy. So this Iranian exceptionalism, Middle East exceptionalism, Muslim exceptionalism, all these discourses are actually fundamentally wrong and suggest that no, actually these people actually want the same things. But at the same time, I think we should make a clear distinction between these grassroots subaltern movement with some sort of top-down hegemonic universalist imposition of so-called Western values, neoliberal values, which has been actually used and enforced by military forces and so many other countries in the West, the case of Iraq, Afghanistan, things like that. So I think this is a very good example of this grassroots movement. In terms of obstacles and weaknesses, perhaps, I'm sure all of us know there's a famous quote by Karl Marx who says that people make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please, not exactly as they want. So it suggests that regardless of what we wish, we don't have absolute power and freedom to materialize whatever we want right away. There are many structural constraints, and because it limits our capability and agency in a way. I do not want to suggest that we should promote a structural determinism, that we should wait for the force of history and I guess material forces to bring us freedom and democracy. No, I guess structural determinism is wrong. But at the same time, perhaps you could say vulgar voluntarism is naive in the sense that social and political forces have no absolute power to materialize what they want, regardless of structural constraints. So the third, perhaps, option, alternative framework is some sort of, I guess, a synthetic approach, a dialectics of structure and agency, in the sense that social and political forces have freedom, they have their agency to pursue their goals, but within certain limits, structural limits. But at the same time, I think they can transform some of the structural obstacle to opportunity. So that's the beauty of this. So to be more precise, I can say in the context of post-revolutionary Iran, we can think of three structural factors and three agental factors, agencies. First and foremost, we have the structure of the state, then a structure of socioeconomic uneven development, and the global structure of power. So let's briefly talk about each and how they may or may not create obstacle or provide opportunity for this movement. In terms of the state, as I briefly mentioned, uh, state now is socially fragile, definitely, intellectually failed, discursively frustrated, has lost its mobilization forces, I guess, power, and also suffers from legitimacy crisis, especially over the past couple of years, if not more. So that's something. It also suffers from some sort of internal factionalism, if you wish. Some elites actually fighting each other, definitely. However, it's institutionally is still very strong. It's determined to fight back. It's quite repressive, and it has still actually its oil money and financial sources, military fund, I guess, military against security apparatus actually supported, still a strong rentier state, lots of financial support and funding, and it's quite determined to pursue its goal. So this shows the complexity of the nature of the state at this point. Fragile socially, but still supported by military security apparatus and I guess financial sources. And the Revolutionary Foundation, all of these things, of course, provide financial support to the state. The second structural factor is the socioeconomic uneven development. Uneven development is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, could create riots, revolution, social movement. On the other hand, actually could create chaotic situation and also benefit some demagogue to have free rides over the legitimate concerns of the people, a typical of populist right-wing movement. So it's quite actually risky. We know that based on all the data and reports, even from the official reports, the post-revolutionary Iran at this point suffers massively from the gap between the poor and rich. So economic, I guess, the class struggle is something is already there, and not only the class in terms of economic, but also from unevenness from all other aspects of the, I guess, social and political. So we do have an army of people who really need job, and there are many poors. So obviously, that's something to be considered. There is more and more middle class poor in Iran. So, I mean, university prof, engineers, even some doctors, a typical of middle class actually are becoming more and more poor, which creates the class of the big class and middle class poor, which contributed massively to the Arab Spring, the same class. And in Iran, over the past 2-3 years, 2017 onward, I would say this class is more visible, actually come to the streets. So that's something to know. But we know that the poor, but specifically, could be easily manipulated and mobilized by some demagogues, hyper-nationalist, populist movement. And this is something democratic forces should definitely take into consideration. So it's quite actually risky. And I don't really have time to elaborate on this factor. So this is, of course, an independent topic for another discussion. In terms of global structure of power, again, I think perhaps unlike some of the folks, I think that indiscriminate economic sanction is not good for grassroots, indigenous, I guess, democratization in Iran. For some simple reason, of course. First and foremost, it kills the middle class, which is the engine of grassroots democratization. And also even organized labor and other classes who are typically indigenous group, authentic group for a local homegrown democracy. So economic, I guess, sanctions, yes, hurts the state, but hurts more the civil society. And we have actually seen this over the past few decades, not only in Iran, but also look at the situation in other countries, Iraq and other countries who've been subject to these um, indiscriminated economic sanctions. It also creates more mafia economy, shadow economy. It actually empowers the security military apparatus to have their own parallel economy and mafia economy and kill the movement and kill the real agents of democratization, which is the middle class. It strengthens the deep state, which is a problem in many authoritarian states, the core state, which is obviously a military security apparatus with some clerical establishment. On the other hand, we know that, well, any external military threat or war against could actually benefit the hardliner and the whole state by militarization of public sphere. Well, fortunately, over the past few years, we didn't really have this sort of threat. But in case if there is such things, I don't think it's good for a healthy process of democratic transition. But on the other hand, of course, the support for human rights and democracy from a global civil society is so crucial and fundamental. And it's good. It's very good, actually, to receive active support for democracy, democratization, human rights from global civil society organization, but not sort of military or even indiscriminate economic sanction. So these are three major structural factors which actually create obstacles, but at the same time, if there are wise social and political forces, they can actually use or transform some of these structural obstacles into opportunity. And here is where we can talk about agency, social forces, political forces. More specifically, when we talk about agency, I can think of three subcategories when we discuss in the context of post-revolutionary Iran. The agency of leaders, so basically leadership of the movement, organizations of the movement, and idea or discourse of the movement. I think in all three above, the current movement is somehow weak, but less weak apparently in terms of ideas and discourse, because there are powerful discourses and ideas. However, more weak on the leadership and more weak on the organizations of these forces. And this is both inside and outside the country, I think. This weakness is actually quite apparent. And we can see why this movement, like the previous movements, actually suffer from these particularly leadership and organizations. Unfortunately, we've seen some really bad, moves from some folks like right-wing nativists, anti-intellectual chauvinists, diaspora outside of the country with respect to this movement, which actually hurt this movement. But let's hope that the democratic forces are more wise in order to use their own agency to transform some of these structural obstacles into opportunities. I think for the women's life freedom movement to succeed in terms of ideas and discourse, we need to have a more comprehensive understanding of the linkage between freedom, democracy on the one hand, and social justice on the other hand. No democratic movement with no elements of social justice, especially in the global south, is going to succeed. We really need to have a very comprehensive understanding of justice, gender justice, economic justice, and of course, political justice and freedom. So that's what we really need to do that. And institutionally, of course, as I briefly mentioned before, a stronger organization and definitely more wise sort of leadership definitely are required. But let me finish by this very brief, I guess, quote I always liked from Antonio Gramsci, who says that we definitely need to overcome with the pessimism of the intellect by the optimism of the will. And this is back to my sort of argument that there is possibility actually to do this if agents are wise and use their power and wisdom to overcome these structural obstacles.